Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is Love Never Dies radio show, and I am your host, Pamela Marie Edmunds. I am a medium, an animal communicator, of course, a radio show host and spiritual teacher, and have been doing work such as this now for about 20 some odd years. And I am broadcasting to you from Sedona, Arizona here, the wonderful, gorgeous red rocks of Sedona. Just had to go get some of my red rock fix, so to speak, before I came for the show, and help me to, center myself, balance myself so that I could be here and present for all of you. I want to say tonight we've got a wonderful show with a wonderful guest. And you know what? I'm just gonna, for anybody who's new here today, just want to let you know, if you're looking to find out who's a guest coming up, check my website, PamelaMarieEdmunds.com. All the information is there. If you're coming in to do the Zoom and something new for you, it's not that hard. We can do it, especially if we've got somebody who understands computers. But it's a great tool to have. I'm going to go with Terri, because I think she's hot tonight. I didn't say it that way as far as wanting to be a part of this. We have Terri Daniel, and tell us, say hello to us, please, Terri, please.
Hello to us, please.
Awesome, some humor. And where is it again you are?
I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Portland, and you said we got sunshine. You got sunshine, and
we got sunshine finally. Yeah, since it's been months since I've seen the sun.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And I'm going to talk about you first, okay? I'm going to read your bio.
All right.
And we have Dr. Terri Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, anybody who has a mic on, please silence yourself if you can. She is a hospice and hospital trained spiritual care provider and end of life educator, certified in death, dying, and bereavement by the Association of Death Education and Counseling, and in trauma support by the International Association of Trauma Professionals. She conducts workshops throughout the U.S., teaches spirituality and bereavement to, see if I say this right, chaplaincy students at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Terri is also the founder of the Afterlife Conference and the Ask Dr. Death podcast. Mm-hmm. I'm saying them slowly so people can.
I'm going to type it into the chat box.
Okay.
Okay. Right, go ahead.
You can just open it up. Okay, it's easy. Terri is also, okay, we got that. And the author of 4 books. That's important. On death, grief, and afterlife. Terri had no idea what she'd be when she grew up, until she was in her early 50s, when her son Danny died at age 16 after a long struggle with a rare metabolic disorder. Danny began communicating with her after his death, and his guidance in this world and the next changed everything. Starting out as a hospice volunteer, Terri spent the next several years pursuing academic degrees in religious studies and pastoral counseling, and also founded the Afterlife Conference, which is now in its 11th year. Over the years, Terri has helped hundreds of people to live, die, and grieve more consciously. Her work is acclaimed by hospice professionals, spiritual seekers, therapists, theologians, and academics worldwide. What is your website? Let's put your website in there, please.
I put all 3 of them in there in the chat box. So if you guys want to copy and paste those web addresses, you will have them. Okay.
Awesome. Wonderful. Now, Terri, I mentioned you and I've worked together before. It's been some time. But what I want to say is what I was really, really drawn to back then was your experience with Daniel.
Yeah.
Because that's your stepping up point, so to speak. Daniel was a catalyst to bring you forward to where you are now.
Right. And it didn't really start there. I was always a mystical kid.
Okay.
So I was interested in this stuff when I was 12. You know, when I was 12 years old, I pulled books from my father's bookshelf. He was quite an intellectual, and he had Carl Jung and books on comparative religion. And I read all that stuff when I was like 12, 13 years old, as much as I could understand it. My family was not religious at all. We were Jewish, but there was like no religion involved. And I read the Bible when I was 16, not the whole thing word for word, but as much as I could, because I wanted to know what all the fuss was about. So, and then when I was 19, I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which made more sense to me than anything I had ever heard in my own culture. And then I started reading like Ruth Montgomery, if you remember her, you know, the old psychics from way back and all that. So I was already in that world. And then fast forward to I'm 45, 46 years old, and my son is diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. And because of the spiritual perspective I had, obviously I was, you know, horrified and grief-stricken and all that. But that aside, I also had the attitude of, wow, this is interesting. I wonder what this means. I wonder why we made this agreement to come here and do this. Okay. So I was already kind of open to looking at it that way. And so after he was diagnosed, he lived 6 more years. He became gradually severely disabled, so that toward the end of his life, he couldn't walk, he couldn't talk, he was in diapers, he couldn't use his body in any way. And then he died. And because I had been doing a lot of really deep meditation work and a lot of mystical stuff, I was not surprised to find communication with him to be very easy after he died. And based on that, I wrote my 2007 book, A Swan in Heaven. And my 2010 book, he basically we just worked as partners, you know, side by side to bring in all that information. But, you know, unbeknownst to me at the time, what was apparently really supposed to be happening was my kid was going to send me to school, just like I sent him to school when he was a little kid on this earth. And so in 2009, long story how it happened, there was the economic collapse. I lost my house. I had no work. And a friend of mine said, why don't you go to school? You can get student loans. It will pay for your living expenses. And I was like, oh, okay. And still not really interested in anything. But then I found this program in religious studies that I fell madly in love with. And then I got hooked on academics. And so that was in 2009. I spent 10 years and $150,000 in student loans, getting all these degrees. And along the way, I trained as a hospice chaplain. I started the Afterlife Conference, which is now in its 11th year. And this has been the journey. And it's, you know, yes, of course, I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for Danny. So he's like the proud parent putting me on the school bus every day. Yeah. You know, telling me to go to college. So how could I not listen to that?
Now, Terri, I remember a few highlights from your story. That first off, Danny or Daniel was not able to communicate.
His name is Danny, and the reason my last name is Daniel is after he died, I changed my last name to his name.
That I knew that. The other piece that is important for people to hear, because of the physical conditions that Daniel was dealing with when he was here, he was not able to communicate then, right?
That's right. He couldn't talk at all.
And he started talking when you went on the other side, right?
Of course. Yeah, because there's no neurology there.
Well, yeah. So those are a couple important highlights here. But you did say a swan in heaven, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I want to say that I believe that's what we focused on before. But since then, you've written 3 other books, right?
Right. Yeah.
Do you have the titles you can share with people in
Sure.
case they're interested?
This the one that came next was called Embracing Death, a New Look at Grief, Gratitude, and God. The one after that was called Turning the Corner on Grief Street. And the new one is called Grief and God, When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing. So what's kind of happened to me through this whole process is I have a very intense and excellent education in religious history and theology right now. I have a doctorate in pastoral care from a seminary. I despise religion and I love spirituality. So where I have come to is this crossroads where those two things have diverged. And a lot of my work now is in helping people who have religious beliefs that complicate their ability to work through loss and grief and trauma. So that's kind of where I've gone in all of that. So let me back up a little bit. So the third book, Turning the Corner on Grief Street, came from, I was doing a lot of seminars and speaking at conferences with a lot of bereaved parents because bereaved, parents who've lost children obviously gravitate to me. And I was finding that they were not healing very well. And I didn't know it at the time, but they were experiencing a syndrome called complicated grief, which I didn't learn about until much later in my education. And I would hear people say things like, I am never going to be happy again. I will never accept that my child died. I will never get over this. I'm angry at God. I haven't, slept in 4 years because all I want to do is want my child to come back. I mean, just really unhealthy stuff. And so I was posting in some bereaved parents Facebook group and we were all talking about this. And I had like a vision that in grief, it's like you're stuck on a street with your feet in cement and you can't walk. But if you could just lift yourself up a little bit and look over around the corner of that street, you'd see a whole world over there that's light and bright and full of hope and healing. And all you have to do is turn the corner on Grief Street or go take the elevator up to the top of the skyscraper and see it from a bigger view. Or go down below the street into the subway and look around in the unconscious. So I posted this on this Facebook group and all these parents got really mad at me. And they said, you don't understand. Have you ever lost a child? I'm never leaving Grief Street. This is where I want to stay. What are you going to do? Write a book called Grief Street? And I thought, yes, that is going to be the title of my next book.
Love it.
So that's how that happened.
Wow. So you touched upon it quite a bit because we chose the topic of the show, which is actually one of your workshops that you use, grief as a mystical journey. And I know as a medium myself, what I've come to see is a lot of these deaths that are happening, loved ones that are passing, are literally pushing their loved ones who are staying behind into a spiritual journey, into a spiritual path, that awakening. Is this an area? This is part of what this is part of what your work is about.
Yes,
correct?
But I would not say that the loved ones are pushing people. I wouldn't put it that way.
Okay.
People are going there because they have been given an opportunity to go there. I don't think our loved ones push us to do anything.
Thank you. You yeah. My choice of words. Yeah. Okay.
Judy, did you want to say something? I see your hand is raised.
Unmute yourself.
It takes a second. The one thing I was thinking when you were talking about people's anger over the death of their loved ones, and I can understand this, but so many people feel they don't want to turn loose of that grief. They don't want to release their grief. They feel like they would be abandoning their loved one if they quit grieving. I've seen that so often, and I have felt it myself a bit when I was younger. So I understand that.
So it's interesting to, let's look at the words that you're using. Quit grieving, abandoning their grief. I can't remember the other thing you said, but that's exactly where people get tripped up, because we don't ever have to quit grieving and we don't have to abandon our grief. We just have to learn how to incorporate our grief into who we become. And that's where so many people get confused, because they think, if I stop feeling my pain, then I will also stop loving this person. And that's not true at all. But there's a lot of really bad teachings out there around grief, especially for parents who've lost children. There are support groups and Facebook groups that give really, really bad guidance about this kind of thing. And they say things like, the depth of your pain equals the love you had for your child. Well, if that's true, then I must need to be in pain every minute of every day, because that's the measure of my love. None of that is true. The universe is very spacious. There's room for everything. And so we don't have to let go of our connections at all. We just have to work with them. And in our culture, we don't have good tools for that. Most grief counselors will just sit and listen to you talk week after week, month after month, year after year. That is useful for a minute, but it doesn't give you any tools. Most grief support groups, everybody's just coming and telling their story over and over and over and over again. A new person comes in, they tell their story, everybody else tells their story, and it's just an endless loop of stories. Our culture is very immature in terms of real processes and tools for working with grief, so that the grief becomes part of your spiritual growth, part of who you become. But it doesn't happen automatically. We need help. So that's what grief as a mystical journey is all about. And you can find that on my website, spiritualityandgrief.com. Is because of the training that I've had as a counselor and a theologian, and because of all the multicultural stuff that I've studied, from how death is perceived in Buddhism, in indigenous cultures, in China, in South America, all in ancient Sumeria. I mean, I've studied all this stuff. And now I see that there's a whole myriad of other ways that we can do it than what we have in this tiny little space of American Judeo-Christian society. So that's what I teach in Grief as a Mystical Journey. And it's not just me talking and teaching, it's ceremonies, it's therapeutic processes, it's body work, it's singing and chanting, meditations, art therapy. There's all kinds of stuff.
Thank you, Terri. Thank you. I was going to say something. It's like, okay. I just want to share, because I know a number of the people who are here, that you have a mixed group. Some who've lost people, who've had loss, but also you get some people who work with individuals who have had losses. So you've got a number of different people coming from a couple different venues, or I'm going to say focus in regards to grief, loss, and so I'm sure you get that in a number of the groups you get
all the time. Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I also teach at 2 universities in the chaplaincy department. Chaplaincy is a whole other discussion. I mean, I have everything from grieving mothers and widows and, people who are expecting the death of their child or their spouse or their parents. I have a lot of people struggling with COVID deaths right now. So I have that over here. And I also have my students who come from all over the world. I mean, I have in my chaplaincy university courses, I have Catholic priests, from New Jersey and Uganda. I have Buddhist monks and rabbis. I mean, I've got the whole spectrum. And I do have a lot of counselors too. And the counselors and therapists who come to my work are looking for these new kinds of tools.
Yeah.
Because talk therapy doesn't move you forward. And it does have an important purpose. So I'm not going to diss it completely. So one of the first things that a grieving person really needs is to be heard. And you do absolutely have to be in your narrative and tell your story. That's critically important. But you don't do that for 5 years. You
Right.
do that until you've expressed it, you write about it, you blog about it, you talk to your therapist about it. But at some point, you need a step ladder. You need somewhere to go besides just being in the story. And a lot of counselors don't have that. And the other thing a lot of counselors don't have is any training in spiritual care. So, they don't have like the meditative processes and what we call continuing bonds. And so I could go on a whole spiel about that.
Are there anybody who would like to address something with Terri here? She loves questions. She's already expressed that. And I know, whenever I'm doing a class or something, I don't want to be the one doing all the talking. It's not my class. Everybody else has stuff that they can share.
Yeah, I would love to hear,
Hands up like so that we can tell her. Okay.
And if not, I'll just keep talking. I could talk forever. So here's something, is grief a topic that we're interested here or some other aspect of this?
Well, grief and spirituality. How do they?
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
I'm feeling that piece. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so here's something you'll find interesting. So back in 1931, Sigmund Freud, we all know who he is, wrote a paper called Mourning and Melancholia. And in it, he outlined how he felt grief should be handled as a psychiatrist. And his idea was that the goal is to get you to stop feeling your pain and, go through the pain, feel it for a while, and then cut off that relationship. That person is gone. You're moving on. That's where we got language like get over it, move on. The person is gone. We don't use that language anymore.
Right.
So that became the model for many, many years until around the 1960s. And it all began to change. And it changed into what we now call continuing bonds, which is where the spiritual stuff comes in. Now, why did this happen? In little history lesson, in 1950, China invaded Tibet, and all the monks in the monasteries got chased out. The monasteries and the books were burned, and the monks fled into exile. They walked across the mountains. They died. They made it to India, and then eventually they made it to Europe, and blah blah blah. Eventually they made it to England and then to the United States, and that was about 1960s, early 60s, and that's when Buddhism came to America. And if any of you are old enough to remember beatniks, who were really into Zen, and certainly hippies in the 60s, we started to embrace Eastern teachings. That's where that all came from. And so what they brought with them was the idea of reincarnation, of course, and multidimensional existence of consciousness. And the psychology community started to catch on to that. And ultimately what happened was we went away from Freud's idea of cut off the relationship and end it to continue the relationship in a different form. And so that the relationship with the loved one doesn't end. Love never dies, right? It still stays. It just doesn't have the same physical form. And so now we're open to thinking, well, there must be other forms. And other forms are understanding people as consciousness, not just as bodies. And so because of that, we know we can communicate with that consciousness. So statistically, probably, I don't know, I'm guessing 90% of people in the whole world believe in some sort of afterlife. But if you ask them, can we communicate with that afterlife? Most of them will say no. And why? Why draw that line? And so I think that's because people expect communication to look like they've seen it in movies, flying tables and lights flashing and things like that. And so, yeah, most of us don't get that. But the thing with continuing bonds is the other thing that happened after Eastern teachings came to the West, fast forward another couple of decades, and now we have the internet. And so now we can see everything. With a click of a mouse, we can see, how did they do a funeral in Kenya? What did they do in the mountains of China with their dead, or in Tierra del Fuego, or in Kentucky, or what do the Christians do, and the Jews, and the Muslims, and the Buddhists, and the Hindus, and the Jains, and the atheists, and the pagans. And so now that we can see all this, our idea is expanding even more.
Yes.
Right. And so that's like the best thing that ever happened. And I'm so happy that I live in this world at this time while I can be part of this.
Yes. Yes. Agreed. I guess in talking about different ways people honor their loved ones who've passed on, take time to grieve themselves. And I'm trying to see what I exactly remembered right. I was reading something in regards to the Queen who lost the Prince recently in UK, and there something about total amount of 30 days that they're supposed to spend. There was a number of things I was surprised to hear.
Was that like a Church of England thing?
I'm
or something?
not sure.
I've never heard that one.
Yeah, well, there were a few different conditions in regards to honoring him, spending time. Well, we're talking, this is the monarchy itself.
Okay, so it's not a religious thing. It's their monarchy tradition.
Right.
Okay.
Right, which I thought was, and I can't remember the other pieces that were tied to this. I wish I could have. I'm not really good with remembering a lot of things, but that's okay. My point being is, it gave me an understanding. Well, here's another way to honor your loved one.
Right.
Here's another way to take some time to go within and to feel the feelings you need to feel. And that's a big piece. That's a huge piece. Are you finding that you're working with people who are dealing with current losses or losses that go way back?
It's all linked together.
Okay.
If our previous losses are not tended to properly, the current loss will bring that all up. I just talked to a man the other day. He's in his 50s. His father just died. And he is talking to me in great detail about when his grandmother died when he was 15. And he was this 15-year-old boy, and this was, 35 years ago. And his parents told him not to cry because boys don't cry and all those things. And he suppressed. And now I'm talking to him, and he's just going on and on and on about his grandmother's death. He's in great detail, and not even taking a breath. I notice that when people tell me their grief stories and they don't breathe while they're talking, that's the trauma, because
Right.
it's kind of a hysteria sort of way of talking. And I could see that in him. And it was like, oh, well, you never got to grieve for your grandmother as a child. So now here's your father. And that's why you're struggling and having such a hard time. So this happens to all of us. And we all have these ungrieved losses because our culture doesn't give us any tools. So if all of you think about, the earliest loss you might have had as a child, a parent or a grandparent, and probably what you had was, depending your age, maybe your parents never told you anything. Oh, grandma went to sleep and she's never going to wake up again. Or grandma's in heaven with Jesus, or whatever they told you,
Right.
which is not helpful at all. And then maybe you went to a funeral where a priest or a preacher is reading a bunch of Bible verses that make no sense to you because you're 7 years old. And that's it. That's all you get.
Right.
And now you're 67 and your husband is dying, or you have terminal cancer, and the only tools you have to deal with it are what you were given as a child, which are very lacking. So what I'm hoping our culture will come to is that we can start incorporating death education in schools, starting in preschool,
Mhm.
And thankfully, fewer and fewer people are, churchgoers and sending their kids to Sunday school and filling them with all of that horrible stuff. And hopefully we'll, grow into better consciousness about death and the afterlife.
Right, right. Well, and I think what we were just talking about was important to bring up, because I mentioned there was a number of people I know who work with people who've just had a loss. Well, be aware that, if they're extremely emotional, they're having so much difficulty in getting through that loss, there may be other losses that have this has stirred up, like you just said.
Right. And so that can lead us into this is another new idea in psychology, a new theory that's relatively new, what they call complicated grief. And that doesn't mean it's complicated like nowadays we say, oh, I'm in a relationship, it's complicated. It's not that. What it means is that there is a normal path of healing from loss and trauma. For example, if your 90-year-old mother died, at the end of a few months, you should be back to normal life. It's a normal death. It's expected. There's a normal expectation of healing on a certain path. That expectation is different for every kind of death. If your 16-year-old kid was killed by a cop, obviously it's going to be complicated path of healing. Because it's complicated by the violence, by the circumstances. It could be because of the relationship. There's all these things that contribute to complicated grief. So those untended early losses are one of about 20 different things. But when you come across somebody who is still angry that their 90-year-old mother died 5 years ago, there's something wrong. And the word complicated is like, think of it this way. If you have a broken leg, let me give you another example. If you have simple surgery, like a nose job, a boob job, or something that's pretty simple, and something goes wrong and you get an infection. So the language they used is, well, we did the surgery, but there were complications. And so that's how we use the word, the process was okay, but something came in that complicated it. So that's where you see a lot of people like that.
Okay. And many of us now are dealing with soul issues. Do you find that comes in the way of a complication?
Well, depends what you mean by soul issues.
Okay. Soul twin flame, soul mate, and therefore it's intensifying grief and loss, and obviously needing to do some sort of, I would say, some sort of therapy, alternative healing to help get through with that.
Well, I see it I think everybody's a soulmate.
Thank you.
So everything they are, the type of relationship and the depth of relationship certainly makes a difference in how the grief process is going to go. But I wouldn't use language like soul issues. It's all soul issues,
Well, yeah.
And so, for example, like, let's say you were in an abusive marriage and you got divorced and you went on with your life. You married someone else and so did he. And then you hear that he dies, right? And you still have like all this anger you never resolved. Your ex-abusive partner died over in another state, and your grief is going to be weird because you kind of hate him, but you still have connections to him. And so, yes, that can be a thing that contributes to complicated grief. So you do that work internally. And it's really very simple. There's a little guided meditation that I do. I can send you a link to it, called the Forgiveness Flyby. And in it, you just imagine this person that you have this really strong link to, whether it's positive or negative. Usually when it's complicated, it's because it's negative, like your father who abused you or whatever the thing might be. And you imagine them sitting there, wherever you imagine them, maybe sitting in their house or wherever you think they are. Just picture them sitting there. And you go and you fly by. You go and visit them with your soul. You just go to them, hover around them sitting there, and say these words telepathically to them, I release you completely. I release you completely to your path. I release you completely from my body and from my soul. I release you, I release you, I release you. You would not believe how difficult it is to do that. I mean, you're all thinking right now about the person who hurt you the most. And could you imagine just completely releasing them? It's really hard to do.
Right.
Go ahead,
Thank
Judy.
you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
Somebody want to talk?
Judy.
Judy, you mute you, sweetheart. We need to unmute you. Hang on, can't hear you.
Oh, do it again. Still muted.
Sometimes we're both doing it at the same time.
Right. Yeah, you just did it again.
All right, I'm stepping away. Judy, there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just thinking, as Terry was describing that I mean, that's ritual, and apparently we need a certain amount of ritual to say goodbye, to say I can live without you. I forgive you, or whatever you're trying to convey through ritual, and I like that. I like that, hovering around, telling them I release.
Well, I'm glad you brought up ritual, because that's what's missing
Hmm.
in our toolkit in this culture. We have no ritual. We have a funeral, and in the church or whatever, and put them in the ground or whatever, and that's it. And so it's the personal rituals that we do internally that make the difference. And if you go to spiritualityandgrief.com, there's a little section on there that you can click on, which is some sample rituals and ceremonies. So I'll give you an example. For my mom's funeral, I did this. And this is something that I learned from the shamans. It's a beautiful little ritual. You can do this for anything, but for someone's funeral, let's say, I had a basket of rose petals and I passed it around to everybody, and everybody took 3 rose petals. And the idea is to blow. This is what the shamans do. They say, blow into the thing. Maybe it's a stone or a flower. The reason you do that is because it makes you breathe. Because when you're in deep grief, you're not breathing, right? You're all crunched up. So it opens up your chest. It's like breath work. And so you blow into the 3 rose petals. The first petal, you blow in all your anger and your sadness. The second rose petal, you blow in all your happy memories and love and positive stuff for that person. And then the third rose petal, you blow in your message that you want to send to them on the other side. So I had everybody at my mom's funeral do this. And then we gathered up all the rose petals and threw them into the grave.
I like that.
That's just one kind of ritual. And you'll find that on that Spirituality and Grief website. And so you can use that for anything, right? You can take 3 rose petals and blow anything you want into them and bury them in the earth, or throw them in the river, or put them in the compost pile, or whatever you want to do with them, to just release stuff out of your body, because trauma lives in the body. So the abusive relationship, the death, the illness that you're struggling with, whatever the thing is, you lost your house, you lost your job, whatever it is, you're holding it in the body and you want to get it out of there. And you put it into a symbolic object, and then you release that object into the universe. And it's incredibly powerful. And you're not going to see many therapists or church clergy that are going to show you how to do that.
Thank you. That's a wonderful piece, especially with the rose petals. That's nice. Comments, questions, shares.
Okay, you know me, I gotta say something.
Okay, Lori.
Hi, Lori.
As Denise laughing, she knows. It's coming up for me on Monday, 5 years for my son Walter.
Mm-hmm.
I lost him to brain cancer. He was 34.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, that 10-year span. Like a lot of other people, I lost my home. I had to move in with my parents for a while. I was help raising my grandchildren, which at first was 1, then was 2, then was 3. And in the meantime, I was taking care of my parents. And as they progressively got worse, I ended up doing everything for both of them. And then my mom got sick, and I was with her through hospice. And I was angry at my siblings because, they didn't want to join in and like help with the party, as I called it. But after she was gone, I thought I was the one that was lucky enough to do that because I got all those special moments.
Right.
And when I was watching my grandchildren today, I was reading a book from one of Pamela's past guests, Born Knowing. And she said, "What are you reading?" And she was one of the ones that was always very open and talked to my son all the time. And she said, "Do you ever see Grammy? Does Grammy ever talk to you?" And I said, "She's only talked to me once, and it was very sarcastic." Um, and I was taking fresh bread out of the oven, and I heard clear as a bell, "You didn't make that when I was here." And I just turned around and said, "Well, we didn't have a friggin' oven." And my father looked at me like, "What?" And I said, "Sorry, you didn't hear that." But I explained to my granddaughter that I didn't miss my mother as much as I missed my son. And
Sure.
she says, "Well, because he was your son." And I said, "Well, not just that, but because Grammy had a very long life." I said, I got to spend a lot of time with her. She made hundreds of friends. And I said, I think that, she got the most bang for her buck, so to speak.
Mhm.
But, Walter was cut short. So, like you, I said, "Oh, geez, when it's my turn to transition, don't think I'm going to ask, what the heck agreement did we sign that I agreed to go through all of this?" So I do have a book in the back of my mind that I have to get down on paper because I think that's one of the reasons.
Well, okay, so brain cancer is the worst thing in the world to witness. It's horrible, and
It is.
I feel your pain of that. And you've had so many multiple losses. A lot of us of a certain age group are taking care of our aging parents on one side, and children on the other. We're in that middle place, and sometimes grandchildren. Um, so really painful for your son, but you have a great attitude about it, but you also have multiple losses. Do you feel like you've addressed those losses sufficiently, or do you
Oh, heck
feel
no. Oh,
no?
no.
Okay.
No. It's like there hasn't been any time for
Right.
me to do that.
Okay, so I just put a link in the chat box if you guys want to copy and paste it and just put it somewhere so you can get back to it later, of a guided meditation that I think would be really helpful for you, Lori, everybody, where you can make contact with somebody on the other side, but you want it to be somebody that you have a good relationship with, somebody that you love and trust. So just follow the directions in there. That'll be
Okay.
really helpful. Um, there's a lot of resources. A lot of it is just the forgiveness flyby. That's the simplest, easiest, quickest one. I did that meditation at one point in my life like 5 times a day. I would walk up to my altar, I would light a candle, I'd envision this person that, had hurt me so much, and I would do the flyby. Then I'd blow out the candle and I'd go about my business. And then if I started to feel really agitated again, I'd go back to the altar, light the candle, and do it again. These things program your brain. And, we know with trauma now that there's something called neuroplasticity, where when there's trauma, you actually see chemical changes in parts
Yeah.
of the brain. And you can actually undo those chemical changes by doing affirmations and practices like this.
Okay.
So, and as far as, missing your son more than your mother, yeah, of course. How old was your mother when she died?
88.
She's 88. It's time to die. That's normal. And, grief like that is not a problem. This is the other thing in our culture. This is America, where everybody's kept alive until they're 105 on artificial life support and all this stuff. We don't know how to accept death here. In many cultures, nobody lives till they're 88, and we just understand that people get old and die, just like a plant in your garden lives through its life cycle and it doesn't have any more juice and it dies and it goes into compost and another plant grows. But we have a very hard time letting go of our aging parents, and we keep taking them to the hospital and patching them up because the doctors tell us to. Do you know that 40% of the Medicare budget, the entire Medicare budget in America, is spent on the last 6 months of life?
Wow.
That's huge. And 25% of that is spent in the last 30 days of life, because we cannot bear to allow people to die
Oh.
who are 88. And then when somebody dies when they're 88, and of course we're going to grieve, we're going to miss our mother and our father. It's normal to grieve. It doesn't require counseling or therapy unless there's some kind of difficult complication, like an ambivalent relationship, like maybe you hate your mother, maybe your mother was abusive. So you've got all this conflicting stuff of, I'm glad she's gone. I don't miss her. I don't feel any love for her. I hate her. I mean, a lot of people have these kinds of things. So there's all these different levels.
I chuckle because I was so tired. I mean, we had help coming in, because thank God, they had their wills all made out, so there was nothing put us on life support. Nobody had to choose; it was already done.
That's great.
And I was lucky enough that they had long-term care insurance, so somebody could come in so I could have a break. And
Yeah.
I had said to a friend, I said, don't get me wrong, I miss my mom. I said, but I am so relieved because I am so tired.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm relieved. My mom died only 2 years ago. I'm relieved that she was in an assisted care place. I'm relieved that she didn't have to live through COVID
Yep.
and be locked in her room and have no social life, because she
Oh, that's
loved her
horrible.
friends and her social life and her knitting group. She would have, it been horrible for her. And I'm relieved because she was sick and she was not happy. And, at her funeral, I was like, everybody else was sad. And I was like, happy. I was wearing all white and I did the eulogy. And I'm sure that many people in my family thought I was just a lunatic, but I was very happy for her.
Well, and I think I've reached a point in my life that I know that there's something beyond this.
Mm-hmm.
Whether
That
we
makes a
want to
big
call
difference.
we grew up going to church. My parents would go to church every Sunday. And it's like, if you believe life after death, okay, so to me, that's the life after your physical death here.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had proof from my son, because we had a good time. We had a great relationship, but he could really be a pain in my ass. And sometimes he still is. So I'm even grateful for that. So to me, that's proof that there is definitely something beyond this.
And me too. When my son died 14 years ago, and when people hear that about me, they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I say, "It's so okay. If it wasn't for this, I would not be here talking to your group right now." I am grateful for this experience. I'm not grateful that I don't get to have him sitting right here, right next to me, but he was severely disabled and severely ill, and it would not have been good for him to stay in his body. So I'm grateful he got out of the body. And I really see this as our agreement, that for some reason in the inner life somewhere, I said, hey, I want to come and teach about end of life care and grief. And he said, oh, well, I want to learn about not being attached to the body. So why don't we incarnate together? We're a perfect match and we'll help each other do this. And I really believe, that is a soulmate. That's a twin flame.
Yeah.
And so I'm grateful for his life and for his death. But I would not say that to a parent in the emergency room whose kid just got killed, of course, That's pretty advanced teaching.
Thanks, Lori, for
You're welcome.
talking, sweetie. Is there anybody else who would like to share or talk before we close? I've got about 8 more minutes. Sherry. We gotta unmute you, sweetie. Got it.
You know what I'd like to ask you? You said like there are no tools that were given. What is the next step to be able to go on without thinking that you don't want to be here without your loved one. And
Well, there are lots of tools. You're not going to find them, you know, in a traditional grief group. Do you go to some kind of grief group or
no,
counseling?
I don't want to, because I feel like I'm on those ones on Facebook and they're really good. But like you said, you just tell your story over and over. And I don't, I
You're
don't
tired
want,
of telling the story. You want to move on to the next step.
well, I don't even think I want to move on yet, but how do I know when I want to move on, and where do I move
Well,
on to?
I don't mean move on in the grief. I mean move on to the next step in the healing process.
Mhm.
How long ago was this loss?
November.
Oh, so this is brand new. And when something, you know, in my workshops, I usually tell people not to come to the workshop unless they're like 6 months out from the loss, but I let everybody in anyway. November, was it your child,
No, it's my husband.
your husband? Okay. So this close, that's only 4 or 5 months or something.
4.
4 months. You are not expected to be balanced at all right now.
I don't think
You
I want to be balanced though either.
you don't want to, exactly, because we need to stay in that deep pain for as long as we need to stay there. So you know, the one thing I would never do is try to get you out of your pain. And so what I would help you do is how to make friends with your pain. Because trying to make, and you know, that was the old Freud thing. Well, we got to get Sherry to stop being in pain. No, that's wrong. So what I want Sherry to do is learn to accept and embrace and love your pain and lean deeply into it. And when you do that, part of the pain, Sherry, is the resistance. As soon as we feel it, as soon as we start to cry, our first instinct is say, no, I don't want to feel this. How do I make this stop? It's like putting your hand in a fire, right? You know, it's hot, you yank it away. And so what I would teach you to do is how to not yank your hand out of the fire, but how to just sit in the fire for a minute, like you're doing right now. You know, you're just in it, and you can cry and you can feel lost, and all of that is good. And you find that if you just allow yourself to sit with that, the anger, whatever you have, breathe, feel, and in 5 minutes, you'll be okay again. And then an hour later, you're going to go back there. Here's something great I'm going to send you. In fact, it's too long. Okay, hold on. I'm going to show you. This is going to be really helpful for you, Sherry. This is the kind of stuff that you don't usually find with therapists. Just give me a minute because I want to find. Here it is. Okay. I'm going to put this link into the chat box. It's called the Loss and Restoration Process. This is also something that's new in grief theory. So copy that link. This is just a little video about me talking about this. So here's what you do with that in that space of pain. It's called loss and restoration. So throughout the day or the week or the year, you vacillate between loss orientation and restoration orientation. So loss orientation is, I'm crying, I'm miserable, I don't know how I can live another minute this way. That's loss. And then 10 minutes from now, that will pass and you'll be like, you know what? I think I'm going to go out and sit in the sun, or you play with your dog, or maybe somebody calls you on the phone and says, let's go out to lunch. And you actually go and you forget about your pain for a minute. That's restoration. And the whole thing is about bouncing back and forth like a ping pong game. Loss, restoration, loss, restoration. You do this all day long. And that's normal. That's what you're supposed to do. So if you understand how that process works, it doesn't freak you out so much when you're in loss, because you know that pretty soon you're going to be in restoration again. And over time, you'll be spending more time in restoration than you spend in loss. So there's this video will explain it, and it shows you how to do like a little tracking sheet where you track your day and you say, okay, at 4 p.m., I was just wanted to kill myself. I couldn't live another minute like this. And then at 4:15, there was a beautiful sunset, and I stopped and looked at it, and I forgot about my misery for 1 minute. And you put that on this tracking sheet. And then at 6 o'clock, it was dinner time. And I remember how I always made dinner, and now I'm miserable and I want to die again. And then at 6:20, it passed. And I went outside and walked the dog. So you keep track of all these things so that you can just watch the movement, because the thing is, you want the energy to move. And you don't feel like it's moving. That's why when I say move on, I mean, to move the energy of that pain. As long as it's moving, you're fine. When it stops moving and you're just stuck in loss, that's when you get in trouble.
Thank you.
I hope that helps. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Terry. And I want to thank Sherry for speaking up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I knew she was a newbie in regards to loss, and I'm so thrilled that she was able to speak up and receive some of the knowledge, some of the gifts that you have to give.
Yeah, and don't get caught up, Sherry, in thinking that you have to make your pain stop. You need your pain right now. Honor it. It's beautiful. Nothing, and I hear what you say. I mean, I had a lady in one of my workshops whose husband died 3 weeks prior. And I was giving everybody these processes, to release their pain with the rose petals and everything. And she's like, I don't want to do this. And that's when I realized that 3 weeks is too soon to come to my workshop. But 4 months is just about right, 6 months maybe. But, anyone who wants to come can come. So just honor your pain.
Awesome. And I just want to check to make sure everybody has access to that chat so that they can get the wonderful information that Terri has been sharing on there. Her 3 websites, some of the wonderful tools that you shared, and the rose petals. This last one here she did for Sherry. All of that information is there. So.
And don't forget the Afterlife Conference. This is
please.
Yeah. So have any of you been to the Afterlife Conference before? So this is our 11th year. Everybody who's written every book you've ever read about the afterlife has spoken at our conference in one year or another. Go to afterlifeconference.com. It's going to be online again this year, as it was last year. It's always been in person. We'll be in person again in 2022.
Good.
So come to the Afterlife Conference, because go to afterlifeconference.com. You'll see all the presentations. And I know you'll find some stuff there that you will like. So I hope to see you there.
Awesome. And then of course your website, Daniel.
Well, you know what? That one is kind of a catch-all for all the other ones. So the 3 that I put up there are the ones that you want. And on the Afterlife Conference page, there's a link where you can subscribe. And I have a newsletter every month called the Afterlife Advocate. And that has lots of interesting news and stories and events, and we'll keep you informed about my events and the Afterlife Conference.
And then I believe there was a podcast too, wasn't there?
Oh, my podcast. Yeah, Ask Dr. Death. I think I put that up there in that. Did I do that one? Let's see.
Yeah, that's listed. Go ahead.
Is that listed? Yeah.
I know it's listed on the bio I read.
It's in the chat room too.
Good,
so
good.
Ask Dr. Death is a little more academic. We interview hospice doctors. We interview shamans and people who are experts in different cultures' view of death and dying. We talk a lot about toxic theology and religious beliefs that are harmful when you're facing death and grief. So if you're interested in that, go to AskDrDeath.com.
Awesome.
I do that with my friend, Dr. Karen Wyatt, who's a hospice doctor.
Awesome. And could you list the books again? There's 4 books, just so people
Do you want me
aware.
to type them in? Or
we're running out of time. Can you just verbalize them for people?
Okay, so the first one is A Swan in Heaven, which is the one where I am channeling my son. And if that's what you're interested in, like really intense channeling after somebody dies, that's the best one. The next one's called Embracing Death. The next one is Turning the Corner on Grief Street. And the next one is the new one, Grief and God When Religion Does More Harm Than Healing.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, Terri, what would you like to say here in closing? Anything in particular?
I would just like to say thank you to you guys for doing the work, you know, for paying attention to this. This is,
Awesome.
that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you for
Awesome.
paying attention to this important stuff.
Awesome. And Terri, I'm going to have to send it to you by the ethers, but I want to send you a great big hug for being here tonight and assisting everybody else here, and keep doing the good work. You're doing some fantastic work for people out there that you're not even talking about. If you follow what I'm saying, some of that's happening underneath, but it's like, just keep it all up. It's growing. People are allowing themselves to listen. Look at how many people here are listening to newness, new ways of looking at loss and grief.
Exactly.
That's what it's all about.
It's all about a new way of looking at loss and grief. And you know, there's no excuse not to look at it in a new way in this world where we have so many resources available to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, dear. And I want to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. And since Terri needs to go, I'm going to close here and now. And I want to remind people, we're still got people who are out there having some challenges. You know, send them a smile, send them a hug, you know, honor who they are, where they are, whatever you feel to do that you can help them. And just know that everything's going to be getting better in a different way. We just don't realize what that means.
Everything's going to be getting different.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And it's something that we're all going to be able to embrace at some point. So anyway, but thank you all for being here. Thank you again, Terri. God bless you, sweetheart. God bless everybody else.
Thank you, everybody.
And I will be posting this here, hon. I will send you a link to it, I think through Facebook, or so I'll send you a link for it, okay? And for everybody else, God bless.
Bye.